Hello everyone, welcome to the channel. Today I would like to discuss a wonderful writer on the basis of one of his books, but really I'll be talking about more than one of his books. This wonderful writer is Magnus Mills, and the name of the book that I would like to principally discuss is Three to See the King. Now, Magnus Mills comes from England. He was born in 1954. He's written to date 15 novels. Restraint of Beast was the first novel. It was actually shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And he's also written, I think, 4 volumes of short stories. What is always associated with Magnus Mills, beyond the books that he wrote, of course, is the fact that he worked as a contractor, I think, and a fence builder. And then famously as a bus driver. So he was driving a bus during the day, perhaps, I don't know, and writing the rest of the day. And of course, that made the headlines at the time when it was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. The Booker Prize is the most important literary prize in England, the most famous one at least. And of course, that came out because we always imagine writers to live this aloof life, of course. And here was this guy driving a bus every day. Now, we want to really talk about Magnus Mills in general, but Three to See the King, that very novel. And we want to try and say 3 things about it, or think about 3 aspects of writing and literature on the basis of that novel. The first one will be really, how does one do so much with so little? It's really the relationship between the simplicity of style and setup, narrative, and the complexity that one can attain. And so, of course, one of the underlying questions is, what is literature, if this is literature? That will lead us on, of course, to a question about how does one read literature in that sense, and the idea of allegorical writing. That is a writing that is so open on the surface, so meaningless on the surface, that it simply begs for interpretation and being read as an allegory or an overall metaphor of things. And finally, of course, we'll have to say something about the whole work of Magnus Mills, in a sense that it follows an idea, it follows certain themes, and he simply comes back to it. And we'll ask whether that is a good thing, or whether that can also be a bad thing at times, and what does that mean when we read Magnus Mills. Now, the setup of Three to See the King is very simple. We come to the narrator, who's unnamed, and he lives on the plain in a house made of tin. Now that's what we know about him. And little by little we'll come to meet some of his neighbors, who all sort of live far away. Right from the off, there is a woman moving in with him. And they begin to hear about this sort of semi-mythical figure, Michael, who's building a canyon somewhere far or close, it's hard to say. And they decide to go and see what's going on. And that's pretty much the setup of the story. And of course, this enables us to move on to our first point, which is everything that's missing, all the holes, the utter simplicity of the narrative and the setup and the social setup as well, versus the idea of complexity. So, first point, how does one do so much with so little? Now, what I've not told you yet about the novel is that in addition to knowing very little about any of those characters, we have no physical description of them. We have no background story to any of them. Nobody says, when I was young, there seems to be no past to those people. They never talk about what happened before, how they came to be in this place. In short, we know nothing about them. But that's the least of it, because you very quickly realize that there's nothing of what we would expect from a normal situation. So there is no, as we can see, electricity. We don't know where they get water from. It doesn't seem that there's any installation or infrastructure to bring any of those things to them. We don't know where they get their food from, because there's certainly no shop around. There are no cars, there are no bicycles. In short, there is a complete absence of what we may term technology, if we understand technology, of course, to refer to any mechanical device that we use. And that's one of the things that will happen. At some stage, one of his neighbors will come to him with, I think, a barometer and say, well, look, this is a newfangled thing, and with it, you can tell what the weather is going to be like. And that's one of the insights that our narrator will give us by reflecting on the fact that he just needs to go out, look at the sky, the clouds, and use his experience to actually do what the barometer does very well. In other words, he doesn't need the technology. Okay, well, that's one of the first clues perhaps we get. Now, beyond the utter simplicity of the narrative and the situation, and the, one could say, complete flatness of the characters, those characters are also named very, very generic names: John, Bill, Mary, Stan, and that's what they do. Now, when we come to the canyon and we get to see Michael, it's the same basically. None of those characters are introduced as having a background story. None of them really will tell us where they come from, why they're here. Well, there's a sort of hint as to why they're here. Now, here we have a classic example, I think, of an opposition that plays out in literature between what people perceive literature should be, perhaps, or is when they only dabble in it, and what it can actually be. I think a lot of people would expect a literary text, one that was shortlisted for a big prize, to be very complex with long sentences and difficult concepts and people thinking about things and lots of descriptions and the like. A whole psychological exploration, perhaps, or something. But this is not at all what we get here. There is no endless psychological exploration of the self. There is no reading of the other. There are none of those social relationships or social sort of links that we expect really from a well-formed community of people. They are not friends, really, those people. They are kind of neighbors coming together. But and again, we know nothing about that woman who moved in with a narrator. We don't know why she's there, and he certainly doesn't know why she's there anyway. And this is it. The sentences are very simple. There are no difficult, complex words. There are no uses of hyper complex syntax or convoluted sentences a la, I don't know, John Updike or Henry James. There are no endless descriptions of beautiful whatever nature or people or anything. Nobody's described. We never know whether somebody's tall or short, anything. Everything is possible. Everything is possible because nothing is really set in stone by the writer. Now, this might be leading some of you to think, well, can that be literature if it's so simple? And that, of course, is our second point we're coming to in a minute. But here we can only think about similar setups or similar approaches to literature or writing literature. Of course, a typical example would be Samuel Beckett, of course, the playwright, 20th century playwright. And Samuel Beckett is the same. I mean, he's set up in terms of his plays. Think about Endgame, think about Waiting for Godot, of course. Utter simplicity of the situation, utter simplicity of the props. There are no props almost, and really a desiccation of the language to some extent. That is, utter simplicity of the language as well. We can also think in very different ways. I'm always reminded when I discuss those things, of course, is people like Penelope Fitzgerald. Now, Penelope Fitzgerald, this immense English writer, of the second half of the 20th century, immense writer, wrote typically very short books, delicate books, very simple books, no pyrotechnics, no stylistic craziness, no long words, no endless descriptions, no endless psychological exploration. And yet she manages to attain a great deal of complexity with nuances, with little touches, with indicating how somebody reacts with her face, or how somebody reacts with his words. And those things need not be complex. What needs to be complex is our approach to them. That is, we need to have a proactive reading approach, of course. You can think, of course, that somebody like, I don't know, more recently, Edward St. Aubyn, for example, in his Melrose novels. It's the same. On the surface, a comic novel, David Lodge, of course, people like that. On the surface, a comic novel, very easy sort of setup. No real, again, pyrotechnics stylistically and the like, although sometimes he is very good. And yet, this is a way to attain complexity. A book can be written in a very difficult way, in a very complex way, in a very sort of original way, you might say. That doesn't make that book necessarily complex as such. The reading of it is made more difficult by the complexity of the narrative, but that doesn't mean that the book itself, the novel itself, the text itself attains any kind of depth. So simplicity, of course, doesn't automatically create depth, but neither does complexity create depth automatically. And we understand, therefore, that literature cannot be defined by stylistic elements. Think about James Kelman, for example. Surely, if you put James Kelman here and Henry James there cannot be more different ways of writing literature. And yet, James Kelman, of course, also won prizes, is also a major literature or literary writer, of course, of our times. So complexity is not an issue, of course. It doesn't define the stylistic element of literature. Complexity is in terms of what the reader is brought to, in terms of thinking about, reflecting, having ideas they didn't have before, making connections they didn't make before. And it's nothing to do, of course, with the surface detail of the text, however important those details might be, which are elements of style, for example. Now, as a last example, we can always remember that Philip Larkin, of course, is one such poet. One could say, okay, not always, probably, but many of his poems reach for a simplicity of language, of form. That doesn't mean that Larkin is not a great poet, because of course he is. So you may write like T.S. Eliot and be complex, but you can also write like Philip Larkin and be complex as well. Now, that leads us to our second point, of course, is what is the point of such utter simplicity in form? And that's, of course, allegorical writing. Now, what is striking about Three to See the King is that once you realize that there are no usual elements in terms of technology, in terms of knowing about the people you encounter, you realize that basically those people are reduced to some sort of exemplar type, prototypes, one could say. In other words, you have two choices when the book is so simple and the characters are so flat, if one can use that old term. The two choices you have, of course, is one, the writer is really poor and he cannot have round, well-developed characters. The second one is no, the writer is doing that on purpose because he's trying to get something from us in terms of what he says about or doesn't say about those characters. And here, typically, of course, the fact that they are reduced to prototypes encourages us to think about their action and what they do and what they say and how they react, rather than try to affix those reactions and those sayings and those thoughts to real people. And that is really important, of course, because by removing a sort of human element, Magnus Mills also removes this tendency we have to empathize and think, oh, that's terrible for him, oh, that's great for her. No, if you want to think, like Beckett did, like Brecht to some extent did, I guess, if you want to think about the concepts, as it were, if you want to have ideas, if you want to come to ideas, then you have to perhaps take a step back and consider those people without trying to label them in any way or shoehorn them, oh, he's from there, oh, she's like that. Something that, of course, we realize is one of the great powers of literature, obviously, is to make us imagine what we are described, but at the same time, we do realize that sometimes it plays against us actually thinking clearly about what's going on and thinking much more about the characters and whether we like them or we like what they come from, where they come from. Another thing, of course, is that this way of removing us from the characters and sort of the situation itself is also to try and separate us from any prejudices we may have, however unconscious, of course, and unthought through, but still, we were all born in a certain place, in a certain culture, and therefore we also are subject sometimes to prejudice about other cultures, about other ways of thinking. So here we have a text that is so open that it invites you to create space for yourself, for your own interpretation, because we can only say, well, look, there is very little for me here in terms of what I usually expect from a novel. If there is very little, then there must be something else for me. What is that thing? Well, pay attention then to what is going on, however thin on the ground it looks to be, of course. And here we realize that this book is intensely concerned with how communities form, how communities develop, what gets them together and what holds them, well, first together and then apart. That is what leads to the destruction of harmony in some sense. We realize that right from the start, there is a harmonious sort of idea. There is a harmony with nature. There is a harmony with one's environment. There is no artificial need created. There is no desire for gadgets or objects that are simply not there anyway. Everything is smooth. Everybody's happy. Everybody believes later on in novel that digging this canyon is the right thing to do. And we realize very quickly that nobody really knows what the canyon is for. In other words, if it is not for a concrete thing, it can only be for the idea of doing it together. The community that creates, the common belief, the belief that everyone has, that brings people together. That is, of course, the reason to be for the canyon. And this Michael figure, the leader of the canyon digging party, is one who basically represents this sort of harmonious community-like coming together of different people. All those people come from different places, we can see that, but we have no idea where they come from, which language they speak, what they look like again. And it doesn't matter because they're here for one thing, it is to create something together. Of course, at the end of the book, towards the end of the book, Mills' concerns, we'll come back to in a second, surface again, because that's where we realize that things start to break down. Now, we have to ask ourselves, therefore, what breaks it down? Since we have no information about backgrounds and about what people know, don't know, have been, we have no idea about their beliefs or whether they believe in anything, we can only, again, look at the way they relate to the situation with one another and what the reactions are. And if we collect enough evidence about different reactions, we start making connections between those reactions, actions, and type of environment. We realize, of course, that there are some, while they're very happy to have Michael as a leader, want to be close to Michael because they want to be close to what they see as power. Michael doesn't see himself as power, he sees himself as sort of organizer. But others see him as a leader. Others see him as the top of the pyramid type of person. So some want to be close to him. Necessarily, some will want to replace him. Some will want to perhaps his place, or perhaps they want to impose their own ideas. Now, Michael said, we're going to dig this canyon and put some houses of tin in it. So people are like, great, that's the plan, that's wonderful. But the moment Michael changes one of those things, because for him, a canyon and houses of tin are just a vehicle for community making. The moment it changes one of the aspects, of course, he is immediately attacked. People say, wait a minute, that's not the plan. Michael tells them it doesn't matter what the plan was. What matters is the intent. People say, no. The rules are more important than the intention. The moment you've set up rules, you've got to follow them. If you don't follow them, you break them. If you break them, this is wrong. If this is wrong, we'll topple you. In other words, a movement that we've seen countless times in human history here, obviously, something that reminds us of the thousands upon thousands of small-time kings who had an idea, perhaps an ideal that they were following, and of course were themselves toppled, typically assassinated or poisoned or whatever, by people who either resented their power or their position, or maybe, quite simply, wanted to impose their own ideas, or resented the fact that the original rules were not followed to the end. What that means here, also for us as readers, is that a typical interpretation here is a social one, that is, a sociological one. How do groups form? What organizes them? And what breaks them apart? Right? And on the basis of this, you can decide for yourself whether, having the intention to come together and create something beautiful is more important than the rules that underpin that enterprise. That's for you to decide at the end of the novel, of course. But obviously here, there are a multiplicity of interpretations, religious interpretation, of course, and I think Magnus Mills suggests that very clearly by some of the vocabulary that Michael, the leader, uses, very biblical-like vocabulary. There are also allusions here and there in the names, in the situations, in the pronouncements that lead you, the reader, to think, oh, wait a minute, is that basically a sort of metaphor for how religious groups form? That is typically, again, people will come together because they have a common belief. That common belief, the moment it grows, will be organized by some people who want power, who want whatever, influence. They start to regulate things. Those regulations will go against the beliefs at times, or will perhaps restrict the belief. The original believers will resent that. And then people will start asking, well, wait a minute, was it a belief or was that a set of rules? And here, of course, you can see the classic, very old opposition between faith and the church, whatever church, of course, organizes that faith. And we do know that these are two very different things, even though many people confuse them. So here that reminds us, in terms of literature, really, is that no, a book doesn't have one meaning. A book may have multiple interpretations, that the better the book, whatever that means, the richer it becomes in terms of ideas it gives us access to. And that is really the most important thing here, of course, is that simplicity can be complexity, can lead to complexity. And simplicity invites allegorical writing, that is, everything I see stands for something else, and this is how I have to read it. Remember, all fiction is, in essence, metaphorical, that is, a metaphor is talking about A in terms of B. Well, that is what the novel does, really. It talks about A, love, or the meaning of life, in terms of B, the story, the fiction, the characters. And typically, we should not resist this sort of sucking in of the reader created by a very open space, a very sort of, on the surface, extremely simple setup and narrative. On the contrary, we should seize that chance to plunge into it and see it as an allegory of what we don't know yet. We haven't read the book, but we're reading it. That's what we have to find out, of course, and that's the beauty of reading literature of that kind. Now, finally, perhaps a quick word about this idea of Magnus Mills following his interest. The Restraint of Beasts, his very first novel, was already about two or three guys, sort of, not entirely socially integrated, as it were, living on the outskirts and basically putting a fence around a large territory, and they have no idea, they don't understand why they're doing that. And I think it comes to be that they have to put a fence because somebody decided there had to be a fence, even though the fence doesn't actually fence anything off. And those ideas come back, for example, in a wonderful novel from 2000 and something, I'm sorry about this, 2009 and 3, the Scheme for Full Employment. The Scheme for Full Employment is a city, maybe Birmingham, where Magnus Mills used to work, which is a system where lorries, trucks bring goods from one place, depot, to another depot. And basically you have drivers, you've got those trucks, and the ideal situation, of course, is that when they leave depot A, they carry something, they go to depot B, bring it there, and then they bring something back. Now, sometimes, for any sort of reason, there's no good to bring back, for example, so a truck will go around empty. Well, okay, that's maybe not the most efficient thing, but people are really happy with the system. It works extremely well. People get their goods, nothing's lost, nothing's stolen, and everybody's happy. And then one day, of course, somebody arrives from the government, really, but it doesn't really matter. It's not an anti-government book, and says, well, look, people, we should be more efficient. We should ensure that everybody who leaves the depot has something in the truck. Okay. Well, okay. And that leads to, of course, some extremely complex ways of devising a new system to replace the old system. The old system, which I remind you worked very well. But now this new system, of course, is going to ruin the whole thing. People will start taking advantage of the system because they resent the system. And in the end, something that worked so well, so fluidly, with which everybody was happy, has become a laughing stock. Everybody hates it, and it finally breaks down completely. That is something that you realize is running through Magnus Mills' novels, one of which, for example, the Forensic Record Society from 2017, I highly recommend, is a wonderful novel about the same sort of ideas as in Three to See the King. So here we have somebody who keeps coming back in some ways to the same questions, all right? And the same questions are, I think, to do with, again, social organization, human organization, human harmony, and why on earth do we want to break what works simply for the sake of putting rules before belief, or rules before the heart, or rules before, let's say, the human dimension. In other words, a system which become a machine, and that machine, of course, in the eyes of this machine, we are people invisible. And in that sense, of course, when we are visible and in charge of the system, it may not be the most efficient way of doing it according to extremely complicated calculations, but it is a system that works. The moment you start treating the system, that is us doing something, any human activity, as a system that must be made as efficient as a machine can be, then of course you lose the human element, and basically you end up with a system that is not designed for humans, it is designed for the machines that designed the system. It is remarkable, of course, that those questions are very much at the heart of our discussions these days with ChatGPT, AI, and the like, where, similar questions, of course, could be asked about what is actually designed for humans and what is designed for machines by machines, and do we not end up being used as machines, even though, of course, we should be in charge of the whole system. And of course, by being used as a machine by a machine, you lose that humanity that is the defining trait of who we are, obviously. It is very interesting to follow, therefore, somebody like Magnus Mills continuing his questioning, selecting different examples. Even though all these books are very simple on the surface, all of them sort of have the same vibe, really. He also takes different examples, different settings, to hammer again the same point, which is, why on earth do we abandon our humanity in the name of a so-called idealistic unattainable, machine-copied efficiency of the system. The rules are not more important than the belief. The belief is primary, and the rules must be second, must come second. Here I can only mention, of course, my hero Borges, the Argentinian writer, because one could say, of course, that Borges did the same thing, not the same questions, but certainly addressed the same sort of concerns he had, or ideas he had, or a mania he had, perhaps, throughout his work. Of course, Borges didn't write a novel, but throughout his short stories and even his non-fiction, and the same themes reoccur, of course, and so each of his texts is a way of asking similar questions that he's asked before, in a different form, perhaps different shape, but the same questions recur. You can think about Ian M. Banks, the culture novel. Okay, it's diluted towards the end of the series, that's very clear, but in the beginning it's also equally clear that there is a social, political concern at the heart of those books, and that the narratives, the novels themselves, are both extremely good on their own as science fiction, top of the range, but also part of, or are a vehicle to ask the same questions again and again, some could say perhaps. And that is a way for Banks to, throughout several books, work out the ins and outs of a very complex sociological and social situation, of course, which is to some extent akin to the one of Mills. There would be, of course, plenty of examples like that. But it's interesting that we're often told, that writers should write new books, should have new things to say. Think about Paul Auster, who sort of wrote two sort of books, really. Very good. I mean, I like him very much, but basically he wrote two kinds of books, one could say. Robertson Davies, the immense Canadian writer. One could say the same thing about him, really. I love Robertson Davies to bits. But yeah, to some extent, he kind of writes the same book many times over. It doesn't sound good to say that, because he's great, he's wonderful, he's very funny, he's entertaining, and he's just immense. But on the contrary, it's not a criticism. You don't have to do new things. If you have things to say, things to think about as a writer, and then you just simply go on with those concerns, and you use texts, novels, short stories, poetry, whatever, as vehicles to air and think about, reflect on those concepts, and put those concepts in new situations to get new angles with which to think about those concepts. So here we have a wonderful example in Magnus Mills. It doesn't really matter to some extent which book you start with when you start with Magnus Mills. Of course, I recommend that you start with this one or the Forensic Record Society. And don't get lost in them if you really don't get it. Just take your time. Think about the fact that everything that is missing is an indication of something that should be there, and so it's an invitation to think about those things. Simplicity, complexity, allegorical writing, open spaces, inviting us in, of course, and realizing that there are some real concerns, concepts, ideas, themes at the heart of those books, because they are written to discuss those ideas. So in conclusion, what can we say? Magnus Mills is kind of unique, really, in fiction, I think, in English fiction, certainly. Unique voice, unique approach to narratives. In a way, very few concessions made, or perhaps or probably no concessions made at all, to what would attract a large audience. His books are eminently readable, but because they are quirky, because on the surface they look weird. You think, what's going on? Why are we told about those? Nobody is doing nothing. It can be off-putting, of course, if you're on the beach looking for a nice, pot boiler, for example. So surely that does him a great disservice, I guess. I'm sure, in fact, not to follow any of the trends, not to write like anybody else, not to do things like anybody else. For all that, his quirkiness, his originality, his idiosyncrasy, he is a wonderful, wonderful writer. His books are unique again. They're easy to get through. but they can take a lot of reflecting if you really want to invest a little bit in these writings. So I can only recommend, as usual, that you simply go out, get these books, buy them, read them, enjoy them, and revel in the fact that we can have somebody so original giving us those great stories every year. It's wonderful.